read you his bio here. Rudy began his career in the greenhouse industry as a summer student, working in a greenhouse as a general laborer. He moved to a management position, growing crops scheduling, shipping, maintenance, and greenhouse repairs and selling. Saying Rudy has done everything in a greenhouse is not an understatement. In 1998, Rudy moved to the greenhouse sales for Paul Boers Limited, bringing with him experience in every aspect of running a greenhouse. Rudy's customers come to him knowing they will get superior service and access to knowledge. Today, he works on project sales, providing turnkey solutions to many startup and expansions. Rudy is focused on efficiencies, how to grow better plants and energy system. I'll give you Rudy.
Thanks, Tom. You asked me earlier, did I write that bio, but I didn't.
Didn't you?
No, I think that was the lady in the office. The facts are correct.
Yeah, okay.
But, no, I've been, just to add to that introduction, like Tom mentioned, I've been in the greenhouse industry all my life. I grew up in the Niagara Peninsula, which is surrounded by greenhouses, so a lot of my friends were also involved in greenhouses. And my first job was as a student. I think I was only 11 years old. A friend of mine in school said, hey, why don't you help us on the farm? So sure, why not? And that's when my eyes were opened up to what the industry is all about. I've loved it ever since. The only thing that I found interesting at that first job was I thought to myself, there's got to be a better way. And that never left me as long as I worked in the greenhouse, and even when I entered the field of sales. I always asked that question, there still has to be a better way. And that's one of the things that we are going to address when we talk about modern greenhouses, what has changed. And to give you a little bit of background, the first job was we grew cut tulips. Now, you know how tulips, you have to plant the bulb, leave them dormant for a while. Well, we had no coolers in those days. They were planted in grape boxes. Then we threw them outside in November. And my job every Saturday was to bring a certain amount of boxes into the greenhouse to be forested, to bloom. Well, you talk about hard work. Those things were frozen right into the mud. That was a heavy slug. And so cut tulips are still grown in greenhouses, but the way it's done today is so much better, so much more efficient. So greenhouses have been used for centuries. It's nothing new. If you look at all indications were that the Romans already had greenhouses. They were growing cucumbers at that time, and the nights get pretty cold down there. So what they were doing is they were carrying the cucumber plants into indoors during the evenings. It wasn't until I think the 15th century that greenhouses became more and more popular in Europe. They were originally, the botanists were using them. They were used by people that had a real love for flowers. Then there was some development for vegetable growing. The interesting thing was, is my former employer, he was a grower in the Great Depression in Europe, and that's when he switched to flowers. He could not sell vegetables, believe it or not, during the Depression. It had to be flowers. So it's nothing new to be growing in structures, but if you were to compare what is being done today as to what was done then, it's day and night difference. And that's for you what is important. And just at the beginning of this, I introduced myself, but I'd like to know what's in the audience here. Everybody here has a greenhouse? Yeah. Vegetable growers or bedding plant growers? Because I can tweak my talk as we're talking. There's no sense talking just vegetables if there's bedding plant growers.
Vegetable.
Vegetable, okay.
Bedding.
Bedding. Okay. I think one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is, sure, greenhouses have changed, but the most significant changes are in the infrastructure and innovative tools that come with the structure. So we just can't think of a greenhouse alone anymore. We have to think of all the systems that go with it. Where we came from. If you went to Medicine Hat, I think that's probably some of the oldest greenhouses in the prairies. That's what you would see. Old lap glass greenhouses, freestanding. Very typical was very low side walls, wooden bars. So with the wooden bars, that was very typical. They had passive vents for cooling. And this worked for many years. But it doesn't work today anymore. What drove all the changes that we see in greenhouses today? Why are greenhouses so different? First of all, circumstances. I think the biggest impact that in my lifetime that I've seen in the greenhouses was the energy crisis in early 1970s. There was a lot of changes that came about then. Fuel prices skyrocketed. Well, not compared to today, but they did skyrocket. And people started thinking, there's got to be a better way. The farmer's attitude of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, guess what? People were going broke, so they had to fix something. When that energy crisis came, we saw a lot more of the double poly greenhouses coming around. People first tried with their old glass greenhouse. You know what? If you put a skin of plastic over it, it'll save the energy. And that was the beginning of double poly. The interesting thing, what really changed the swing from plastic or from glass to plastic was the fact when the polywalk, as we know it today, came out. That was always the biggest dilemma. How do you fasten plastic to a greenhouse? It was always done with nails and slats, and well, you know what wind does with nails and slats, it doesn't work. So those circumstances drove change. Research. Don't underestimate the value of research facilities. Because of the research facilities, we are able to get so much more out of the greenhouses. I wouldn't say that the research facilities have pushed the change in the greenhouse. What they've done is they've recognized the problems, they've recognized where we need new varieties, and because of that, the new modern greenhouses work. And it's an interesting development, because part of the problem with research greenhouses, they don't get a new greenhouse every 2 years. A lot of research that is being done are in greenhouses that are already 15, maybe 20 years old, maybe 5 years old. So they don't have the capability to test the newest and latest greenhouse, because by the time they get that budget approved, it's already outdated. But what the research people have done, and it's been so valuable, they've been able to develop varieties that work in the new greenhouses. And then I've got climate there. Climate continues to change. Climate here in Saskatoon is totally different than the climate in British Columbia or Ontario, even Alberta. And I think one of the biggest things that a grower has to understand is, what's my climate? What's the climate I'm trying to get in the greenhouse? And then, believe it or not, there are buildings, there are structures that give you the tools to adjust the climate. And that's something that we will be discussing this afternoon. So, what's important for you? I already mentioned climate. There's labor savings, knowledge, profit, and equipment. So the number one thing is if you, the plants need the climate. So that's a kind of a given, and the research will tell you what you need there. If you don't have the knowledge, you can have all the fanciest greenhouse, all the systems in place, but if you don't know the basic knowledge of what makes a plant grow and what a plant needs, Dr. Mercer really highlighted that with irrigation. You know what, you can have the most expensive equipment, but it's not going to give you the results. Labor savings, Glenn mentioned that this morning. That is very important. It's not only that labor is expensive, it's getting more difficult to find people willing to work. And believe it or not, even if I look around the room here, we're not the youngest generation anymore. And guess what? After doing it for 30 years, your knees start to give out, you start getting a sore back. So you have to think about that when you think about a modern greenhouse. And of course, there has to be profit. At the end of the day, as much as you enjoy growing, and I think everybody that's in this business is in it because they're passionate about it, if there's no profit, it sure takes the enjoyment away. So all these things, they're yours to have, but it takes an effort. Now I just threw this slide up here, and I'm just showing you a crop of gerbera, both grown in a plastic greenhouse, but look at the difference in the crop. The one on the top, that was taken about a month ago in India. Dr. Mercer knows who was in the picture. He got the same picture as I did about a month ago. So there you see a plastic greenhouse, and below you see a plastic greenhouse, which happens to be in British Columbia, growing the same crop, but look at the difference. The number one thing is soil, water. It's everything else but the greenhouse. Now, I'm not telling you don't need a greenhouse, but they're doing something wrong there, because they could have very close to what you're seeing in the bottom picture if they understood soil, they understood fertilization and pest management. So just because you have a fancy greenhouse, it's not the only solution. And I really want to stress that, because so often I hear people say, yeah, well, if I had a brand new greenhouse, it would be easy. No, you still need that knowledge. So when it comes to greenhouses, you cannot talk greenhouses in one breath. There is so much diversity and differences in greenhouses that are out there. And I'm starting at the most inexpensive greenhouse, not necessarily the worst or the least of value. It's the cold frame, or today they're getting the new name called crop tunnels. And there is definitely a place for the crop tunnel and the cold frame. This picture here on the top, or both pictures, they're taking in Bradford. This gentleman probably has by now, I would say, 200 of these cold frames. And all he grows in there is oriental vegetables. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of that stuff. Maybe you recognize what it is. He has no heat, no electricity. All he has is irrigation. He came to me about 4 years ago. He says, I have a problem. He said, with all these greenhouses, it takes me too long to open and close the doors. So we sat down and we said, okay, well, let's think of a solution. And I came up with a solution for him. As you can see here, we have, instead of having doors on every greenhouse, we have a roll-up door. So now he can go with his little ATV park here, opens up 7 greenhouses, walks across the laneway, 7 greenhouses, 7 greenhouses. It used to take him 2 hours for the guy to walk from the beginning, open all the doors in the morning. He had sliding doors. And that became a cost factor. And this, he loves it. It works great. But that just goes to show that you don't necessarily need the top-end greenhouse to grow the crop, but you cannot grow a tomato or a cucumber in this situation. What he's growing in there, it works very well. This year, we had in Ontario a few very heavy rainstorms. We had 2 hailstorms. I've never sold so many cold frames as in the last month. All those growers are all saying, you know what, in my crop tunnels or my cold frames, I have an excellent crop. and outside it was a disaster. So you have to think about, again, when you're looking at a structure, what is it you want to get? Then you have to look at it from a budget point of view. This is low-end budget. You're not going to get the same dollars per square meter out of this greenhouse as you do out of a state-of-the-art tomato or pepper operation. But you don't need it because your investment is a lot lower. So it doesn't matter what you're looking at, you have to do the math, and only you can do that. Freestanding houses, they're extremely popular with the bedding plant growers. They're very versatile. They've got fairly high sides, lots of air in there, and a lot of light. I have some growers that have gutter connect greenhouses as well as some of these freestanding houses, and they tell me that dollar for dollar they can grow more product in the freestanding house because there's so much more light coming in. So you can have a crop of hanging baskets in there, and you still get considerable amount of light through the sides and the end walls, that you can get more hanging baskets in there per square foot than with a gutter connect greenhouse. So there's another trade-off. The other interesting thing with the freestanding houses is, and which is very lucrative to a lot of people, they can shut them down in the winter or in the fall and walk away from them. Whereas gutter connect, guess what? They're nice for working in, but you've got to melt the snow. If you're in the snow belt, that's expensive. Gutter connected double poly. I would say in Ontario 10 years ago, it was about 85% of the sales were gutter connected double poly. Right now, in the vegetable sector, I think it's switched from double poly to half Venmo glass. And there's a few reasons for that. When you talk to a grower, can you get as many kilos out of a plastic greenhouse as a glass greenhouse? There's some growers that are getting more kilos out of the plastic greenhouse than out of the glass greenhouse. But the biggest problem and dilemma that we're starting to see with these large gutter connect double poly complexes is who's going to change the poly every 4 years. It's becoming a real problem. The older generation, we don't like doing it anymore. The younger generation, they all say they're afraid of heights. And then we have the Ministry of Health and what do you call that? But anyways, they really frown upon it. They see people dangling on a gutter with a roll of plastic. They have no sense of humor for that. So when you have 1 or 2 greenhouses, it's a challenge. But if you have 30 acres or 40 acres, it's huge. And then you have, well, the plastic is being recycled now. In Ontario, you can sell your used plastic. It's all being recycled. But if you're in a remote area, you know, it'll cost you more to ship it to somebody who's recycling it than what you will get for it. One of the things about the gutter connect double poly, they're still relatively easy to build. Most people can build it on their own. You get the kit, you put it together. If you have a Venmo glass greenhouse, you need a company that specializes in building glass greenhouses to build it for you. There's just, it's just too complicated to do on your own. The one thing that's always been a negative about the double poly house has been the high humidity. Now, a cucumber grower will tell you, I want the high humidity. I can't grow it in a glass greenhouse. And that argument is still there. There's some guys that say, no, I can grow good cucumbers in a glass greenhouse, and there's others that say, no way. So, but there again, it's how you use the tools that you have in your hand. Gutter connected glass greenhouses, they are becoming more and more popular. We sold actually, I think we did sell the first major gutter connect glass about 5 years ago in Medicine Hat, Alberta. And they've done a few expansions ever since. The concerns were, and rightly so, when it gets so bitterly cold, how does that ice come off the glass? That was a real concern. For you that still remember the lap glass greenhouse, maybe somebody here still has. Does anyone have a lap glass greenhouse?
Yeah.
Does the ice ever come off in the winter?
On sunny days.
On sunny
Yeah,
days?
Most of the time. Ice slides. Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't want to be on the outside.
But you know what? They've learned to deal with it, and I think that the biggest reason is the price of the glass greenhouse has come down, and it's not so much that the materials are less. It used to be. It used to cost double to build. The construction cost to build a glass greenhouse versus a double poly. Right now, believe it or not, depending on the project, they can build a glass greenhouse for the same price as double poly. And that's because of equipment. If you look at that scissor lift there, it's a machine that's being built in Holland, especially for building glass, but it has robotic arms, hydraulic arms for lifting the glass. I mean, it's just phenomenal how fast a greenhouse gets built now. And you know what, if you're a mom and pop operation in the prairies here, building 10,000 square feet, you know, it just costs too much to bring that machine around. So let's look at what's most important for a greenhouse. And we're talking about the modern greenhouse. Of course, central is the crop. Unless you're maybe into retail in a garden center, you might say aesthetics of the outside appearance has some importance. But by far and large, the crop is what it's all about. And what does the crop need? Crop needs light, very important. Crop needs heating or ventilation, depending on the season. You need irrigation in the greenhouse. You need CO2. And I even put screens there, or energy curtains. And I'm going to talk about where energy curtains and screens have an important role. So let's look at those individually. Light. This is a Venlo complex that we built last year in BC. Glass lets in 89% of light. That's your standard glass. If you have low iron glass, so they use a different type of sand, it's a more expensive process. So they call it low iron glass. It's 91.1% light comes in. When you have double layer of poly, it's kind of an industry standard 81%, polycarbonate 80%. Now, I've got a note on the bottom, diffusion. We're not being totally, light by itself is not the whole story. There's been a lot of talk the last number of years in glass greenhouses about the advantages of diffusion, diffused light. Now, what is diffused light? Anybody that has a plastic greenhouse with thermal plastic, so most plastics now that come with your anti-drip, it's also thermal, IRAC they call it. A lot of people don't even realize what they're getting. They just say, I need anti-drip. And they get the thermal plastic. One of the things that happens to get the plastic, especially with when they put in the anti-drip and the IR, they get a higher diffusion. And it's very important. What it is, the light comes in the greenhouse and it scatters. And in Holland they call the scattering, they gave it a name of haze. And then the percentage of haze is the fraction of light scattered more than 2.5 degrees. In a double poly greenhouse, it's been long known that you have diffusion. What it means is the light comes in and it spreads. And especially the bedding plant growers, they'll see on a hanging basket, if the hanging basket is in the direct light, you'll see that one side of your basket is under stress. It's wilted, it's kind of hanging there. While the other side, which is in the shade, is still looking pretty good. So now when you get a higher diffusion, that light is being spread, it goes into the canopy, and you don't get that intense light right directly on the plant. So they found out now with glass, they're starting to do diffused glass. A few years ago, Joe Doof in Lacombe, Alberta, he had the very first glass greenhouse in North America with diffused glass. Now his only problem is he can't really tell what regular glass would do, how it compares to regular glass, because he doesn't have any other clear glass greenhouses on his farm. But this picture here, if you look right here, this is a plastic greenhouse with diffused plastic. The roof vent is open, and there's direct light coming in through the open vent. And you'll see this looks like racing stripes. See that there? Unless you know what you're looking for, but you'll go into any greenhouse in the summer, and you'll see when the window's open, all of a sudden you see a white line. It looks like a painted line. That's because the light is coming in direct, and that just goes to show you what diffusion does. So you can literally see it through the open window or without any. The light is direct. So what happens in case of your hanging baskets and in case of your vegetable plants, at the top of the top leaves are getting an overabundance of light, and down in the bottom canopy, you're not getting enough light. The testing in Europe is going full swing towards trying to get calculations as to how much it improves by having diffusion, but it's definitely one of the advantages that the double poly greenhouses have had, and you'll also find that you have shorter internodes because of the diffused light. Go ahead.
Is there many structures using twin wall polycarbonates?
I would say in Western Canada more so. Here in the prairies, yes.
And diffusion is good in twin wall polycarbonate?
No, not as good as in the. They just, I believe this year, one company has come up with a diffused polycarbonate now, because they've recognized that void. Okay. And where it's all coming from is, believe it or not, it's the southern climates. It used to be that greenhouses were for us in the north. Like that was greenhouse country. Down in the south, you didn't need greenhouses. Well, you know what? There's more greenhouses being built in the southern hemisphere than there is up here in the north anymore. But they still need greenhouses. They don't have to heat, but they still need greenhouses. Their costs are in cooling. But that's where this idea of diffusion and light reflection has come from. The research in the south. In California, they're almost all going to a diffused polycarbonate or glass. Irrigation. Now, Dr. Mercer spoke extensively about it, so I'm not going to repeat, but I thought it was interesting what he said, and the reason I had that slide there, I didn't know that what he was going to tell you, but I preach the same as Dr. Mercer. The most important thing about a modern greenhouse or any greenhouse is your water. And what I see when I go from place to place, and trust me, I go to a lot of greenhouses, it's the last thing people think about. They call me up and say, listen, I need a greenhouse. Okay. Where are you going to put it? Here. Oh, okay. Do you have water? Do you have natural gas? Do you have... No, but I have the farm. That's what I need. You know what? Water... People say, yeah, I got a well, I got lots of water. Water is not water. I think Dr. Mercer made that abundantly clear, so I won't talk too much about that. But I do want to point out that most modern greenhouses, anything that we're doing now, the municipalities are forcing us to collect water. They don't want water runoff, water management. Maybe in the prairies it's not as big of an issue yet. And recycling. It is big. It's in Ontario where there's a huge greenhouse complexes. The ministry is coming in and they're mandating that the growers smarten up. And if you have an old place, it's pretty hard. We're just hoping that the ministry will have some patience as growers deal with it. But the best way of dealing with it is recycling. And for those that have taken the investment in recycling, and they're mostly the vegetable growers, because it's easy to do, is they're finding that 100% recovery is attainable. Now, the number one thing, Dr. Mercer said it, sodium. That is the biggest problem, right, Dr. Mercer, when it comes to continually recycling. How do you deal with the buildup of sodium? And that's what we talked about earlier, the research people, they're addressing it, and they will come up with something. There are some growers there that have come up with solutions. Sometimes the solution is dilution, but it's being aware of it is the number one thing. Once you're aware of a problem, fixing it is, you can always pick up the phone and ask for help. Heating. Heating is you can have the nicest greenhouse, but the heating system is very important. I know for many of you, it's one of the most costly of your whole business model. So heating, you should take it into consideration. Some of you heat with unit heaters. Smaller operations are probably mostly unit heaters. But there too, even on unit heaters, and I'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation, you have to look at your control. A simple thermostat honestly doesn't cut it. It works, but it's costing you a lot of money. There are some controls out there that are very simple, but the whole key is that same controller that controls your cooling, that same thermostat should be the one controlling your heating. And the old traditional ways, you had a heater there with a farm or an air switch here, and a thermostat with a mercury thermostat over there for the fans. And you know what? They're always fighting each other, especially in the spring and the fall. Boilers are great, but I know there's this idea out there that boilers is the most efficient heating system, but it's not the whole picture. When you have natural gas, whatever fuel, propane, natural gas, coal, biomass, there's X amount of BTUs in a unit of fuel. When you burn in a boiler or in a unit heater, your efficiency is all about what goes up the stack. So that fuel gets completely burned, whether it's in a boiler or in a unit heater. It's what's going out the stack is where your efficiencies can be gained. Now, when you have a open draft chimney, they're the worst. I mean, they're sucking your heat out. So if you're looking at furnaces, the medium, I call them the medium efficiency there with a blower on the chimney, they, I think, are your best bet unless you're heating 12 months or the whole winter season. Then you might even look at the high efficiency units. But again, with boilers, the efficiencies of the boiler are gained in capturing heat that goes out the smokestack with condensers. You got to think about where you're putting the heat. Floor heat is great, but understand the whole principle of floor heat, because you cannot rely on floor heat for heating your whole area, because your floor just gets too hot. That's not good for the roots. I've always used the rule of thumb, 10% of your heat demand from the floor. So, conservation, honestly, that's the simplest. Whatever heat you put in there, try to conserve as much of it as you can. And that means just having a tight greenhouse, and energy curtains, which I'll be talking about shortly. Ventilation. Every greenhouse needs ventilation. It's interesting how the greenhouses have changed. Remember the old lap glass greenhouse? It had roof vents. They were opened manually by a chain. Then in the 50s and 60s, everybody was putting in fans. Then in the 1980s, greenhouses became a little longer. Fans didn't work as well. The cost of electricity went up. Roof vents became more popular. All the way through the 90s, up until about now, roof vents are pretty much the norm for greenhouses. But if you look in some of the biggest vegetable places, which Howling is building, and Winsett Farms in California, they're getting away from the roof vents again because of the insect infestation. So they're going back to fans, but it's called a closed, semi-closed greenhouse. So it's interesting how the cycle keeps turning around. But what drives it is understanding the needs of the plant. When you understand what the plant needs in California, guess what? They have a lot of sun, they have a lot of light, they have a lot of insects. But what they need is they need that extra cooling because it gets too hot. So even if you had roof vents, the bugs would be coming in, but it's still too hot. So they're actually have cooling units, and they're maintaining the climate that way. Fans, they still work really well on small, short greenhouses. If you have a small bedding plant place and you only run it for a few months of the year, fans is probably still your best bet. And don't underestimate the value of venting from the walls. Whether that's roll-up walls, again for bedding plant growers, that's more the norm. Vegetables, I don't like it for vegetables. It creates too much climate change in the greenhouse. The one thing that, as you get a bigger gutter connect range, the gable windows, they actually will drop your temperature about 10 degrees in the summer by having gable windows. If you have a large gutter connect range, and the whole reason is you start getting more of a draw coming out the roof. So if you have a gutter connect range, you say, well, it's just too hot here in the summer, you might want to consider gable windows. Screens. And I'm making a statement there that might be kind of bold, but Glenn he said the same thing this morning. I believe screen is the most underutilized tool available to growers. It's really become a tool for you to use. They're great for energy savings. I don't think I have to preach that anymore. Everybody knows how much energy you can save by having your screen closed. They're also used more and more in the summer for cooling. And it's not the same screen as you would use in the winter time. It can be, but they typically are too much shade. So what they have is they have a Swenson calls it their Harmony screen, which is white. Instead of the aluminum strips in there, they've got white strips. And what it does two things. It keeps the heat out. The second high, what they really are finding beneficial, it scatters the light. It has high diffusion. So I know the Gerber growers in BC, they're finding that, and I think the Gerber, I'm not a plant scientist, but they really get stunted with high temperatures. And they found that by using the Harmony cloth in the summer, they don't lose the production, and they're keeping it 2 or 3 degrees, but you might think that's not much. But if you understand how the plant works with photosynthesis, transpiration, there's a certain point where the plant is too hot and it takes energy out of the plant to cool itself. And the plant starts shutting down. It's basically what happens. Go ahead.
Do they actually have two separate types of cover? Would they change them up mid-season? Or?
You know what? It's almost, with a glass greenhouse, it's almost normal now to put two screens in. The one goes on the top of the truss, the other at the bottom, and they'll actually open and close opposite way. I sold a greenhouse a couple of years ago to an orchid grower. He's got 3 screens. And that's all to manipulate the light, depending on the light, because it's for energy savings, but also manipulating the exact amount of light. But when you start working with that, you really have to understand what a plant is doing, especially when it comes to vegetables. And you'll see a vegetable or a tomato, or especially tomatoes, I think, are probably the most, you know what, peppers and cucumbers too, they're very sensitive. And that has to do with that transpiration. Peppers, if I understand it right, if it gets too hot, the energy goes out of the fruit, so the fruit actually goes small, becomes smaller if it's too hot, and that energy goes into the plant. CO2, I think most people know, it's pretty common knowledge how important CO2 is for plant growth. It's interesting how to get CO2 in a large vegetable operation. It's quite simple to get it from your boiler, but it becomes a little more complicated what you do with the heat when you're running the boiler to get CO2. Well, what they're doing is they're putting it into a buffer tank or a heat storage tank. But I always tell growers that you have to be at about 5 acres or more to make that business model work. I've seen some smaller places that have made their own, and they made it work. Especially if you have biomass, heat buffer is very important. You want to have your biomass boilers burn efficiently, then to put the heat into a tank and let the tank feed the greenhouse. It's the best way to do it. Computer controls. I think they save money. Everybody looks at it, oh, I can't afford that, I'm too small. I still maintain that you can't afford not to have it. They have systems out there that are very basic. I find the most interesting systems are ones that you can buy and build up. And part of the problem with your Priva and your Argus, you have to invest so much to get started. You pretty much have to buy the whole package, and then you can add on to it. But there are some other ones out there that they're very adaptable. And there's one company in Quebec, that's a picture of this one, and I find they're very user-friendly for the small to medium-sized grower. And the big thing is they save you money and time, so they will pay for themselves. You want a computer that you can at least keep records, because how do you fix something? How do you understand what happened if you have no records? And I think that is one of the biggest weaknesses of growers. I was the same when I was growing. I kept very few records, but as I go around and I see crops and I see what people are doing, I can always see the ones that keep good records. I can tell by their crop. I'll go into some place and say, you know what, last year we had so many light units, but then you can be reactive rather than dealing with it after, oh, my plants look bad. So records, I think, are a great peace of mind while you're away. We live in a day and age where everybody likes to go away for the weekend, and guess what? When you have a computer control, you can still be away and have that peace of mind. Yes, this is the temperature of my greenhouse. You can see it on your phones now. And the interesting thing for larger operations, and it's not that expensive, it's where they track individual employees. And everywhere where I went that has put this in, they all said without a reason of doubt our employees are behaving better. Just the fact that they know they're being tracked, they pay attention to what they're doing. And it's not that they were goofing off on the job, but what will happen is, just so you understand, each row of vegetables is numbered. So they have they wear a watch, which is actually a barcode. So when they go into that row, they go, poof. So they're registered. They'll pick that row, and depending on how thorough they are, they'll have a weigh scale at the end, so you weigh how much product comes off of that row. And now the grower can look at it and say, hey, that row is not producing. There must be something wrong. Maybe some drippers are plugged in that row. Maybe there's a draft. So he can sit in his office and already say, hey, there's something wrong there. What's going on? Or, more than likely, what the problem is an employee's not pruning properly or not leafing properly. And now the employer can go say, listen, you're the one that's always in that row. Look what's happening.
It's also all time stamped, so therefore you know that person picked X number of kilos in a half hour or something.
Oh, it's amazing. They almost, the minute it comes in, the employees say, what are you doing? What is this? And they say, oh, I'm being tracked. And guess what? They all smarten up. Because you can tell that after, if people aren't being diligent in picking, and all of a sudden you get, your cucumbers or your tomatoes are overripe coming out of that row. Well, hey, he picked in there yesterday. Why are you leaving so many? So the conclusion. When choosing a new greenhouse, think total solutions. And if there's anything that I want you to go home with today, is to think of the whole picture. You can buy the fanciest greenhouse out there, but it's not going to do it for you unless you have the knowledge what to do with it. You have to have the vision of what you want to get out of it, and you have to have the business model to make sure that, it will work. And if you've done all that, guess what? You'll enjoy growing. I can guarantee you, I've seen it. I've seen many places that start. They've got the drive, they did their homework, and it works. Questions? I want to leave some time for questions. Go ahead.
I noticed you haven't said anything about lighting.
Yes, lighting. That's an interesting one. Lighting, there's no question about it that lighting does pay. Mostly in the vegetable way, I think it's in the greens, the lettuces, the greens, and the cucumbers. Tomatoes in the north here, like in this area, if you were to grow tomatoes, lights would work very well. But the only thing is when you're growing tomatoes under lights, you need to have a better price point. So in Quebec, it's interesting, in Quebec, there's a lot of growers that grow tomatoes in Quebec in the winter, because in Quebec, they like to buy local. That's obvious. And they're not feeling that pressure from Mexico. And I think that has something to do with marketing. I don't understand it completely. But in Quebec, they're getting a premium for their tomatoes. Well, the prices in BC, Alberta, Ontario are down in the gutter because of the Mexican influence. They're still getting it, and people are buying it because it is local.
Any particular thoughts on lighting systems?
You know what? You do your homework. The plant scientists, they'll tell you how many moles, I think is what they work with now, you need per plant. And just throwing lights in your greenhouse, you know what? You're wasting your time. I was in a greenhouse. It's interesting you asked that question. Small operation. He was a Mennonite. I have a lot of respect for how he was trying to get more out of it. But he was growing your leafy greens in the soil in a greenhouse with lights. And the first thing I said to him when I went in there, I said, do you have CO2? He said, no. I said, you can put all the lights in here you want, but if you're not adding CO2, you're wasting your electricity. And he kind of looked at me. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, when do you see that stuff starts to grow? I said, is it in February? He said, yeah. He said, January and December and January, things, they just sit here, even though lights, and then, yeah, in February, he said, yeah, things start to perk up. I says, that's because your exhaust fans are coming on, and you're bringing in fresh air from the outside. That's where you're getting your CO2 from. Plastic greenhouse, if you got to shut down, the CO2 is gone almost right away, unless you have a leaky greenhouse. But as the greenhouses become tighter and tighter and energy costs go up, there's no, you deplete the CO2, and you can add all the lights you want. So this year, that was towards the end of the season, I got him hooked up with a CO2 unit, and he said, even though it was in March, I think, he said, I'm noticing the difference already. So again, lights, yes, but if you're spending the money on lights, you better make sure your soils, your nutrients, your CO2, all the other parts of the equation are bang on, or it's going to cost you a lot of money.
What about LED lights? Poor type of experience is coming in now.
There's a lot of write-ups. There's a lot of skepticism, but the numbers are coming out that hey, it looks pretty good. So I would not personally, I would not invest in LED lights right now yet, unless you have a research facility. Some growers that have LED lights, and they're basically on it's under the research and development, so they get some government funding, and that's good. That's the only way we're going to learn if it'll work commercially. But it's I think it will come. The interesting thing with the LED lights is you can be light selective. I didn't talk too much about that, but with plastics, one of the advantages of plastics over glass was you can get light selective plastics. Here in the north we don't deal with it too much, but when they're growing in the tropics, they don't use the same plastic that you use. So, another question. Go ahead. Ladies before gentlemen.
There's also research out in terms of the interaction between the various elements you're talking about. For example, bumping up the CO2 can enable some growers to reduce the temperature of the greenhouse and still produce a very high quality crop. Also targeted heating. So rather than heating up the whole greenhouse, target the root zone and look at the growth advancing there.
And that's that plant science that I was talking about earlier, about knowing the cycle of transpiration and photosynthesis and dealing with humidity. Humidity, was that you or Glenn this morning was talking about dehumidification? It is a big problem, especially in a tight greenhouse. And guess what? Glass greenhouses, they're building them so tight that you can get humidity problems in a glass greenhouse as well. So that whole plant science is what makes a plant grow. When is it generative? When is it setting fruit? And knowing that every step of the way, then you can take the tools that you have in a modern greenhouse and use them to your advantage. But if one thing is missing, you're wasting money. It's that critical. Whether it's the fertilizer, whether it's the light, whether it's the CO2. But I like what you're saying about temperatures. That the new research is very interesting. And even with the screens, I know that the pepper growers, what they're doing is, well, the plants are young, so a lot of them will plant their peppers in the end of December, some in January, in that window. What they'll do is the first, I think, month, they'll have their energy curtain closed on the cloudy days, just because you know what, you don't need all that light in the beginning of the stage. So the trade-off is I might get a little less light, a little less growth, but the trade-off between that and my energy costs. But there again, you need controls to tell you. You need that control to tell you when's the best time to open your screen. When I was always under the impression, I'll be honest with you, when we had screens, we put them in where I worked. We were the 4th place in Ontario to put in energy curtains. And, you know, I was old school. Everything was about light. So at the crack of dawn, boom, we opened those screens. Now the research is, guess what? Photosynthesis doesn't start till there's a certain amount of light. I didn't know that then. You can save huge dollars. So basically what you're doing and what's happening is you're letting a little bit of the natural light, and it doesn't take a lot of light to heat up a greenhouse, so that canopy above the screen is already heated before you start to open it. Makes a huge difference. Plus, on your plants, not going through shock. I think we had another question there.
Yeah, like 2 parts, I guess. One on the control unit you were talking about from Quebec.
Yeah.
Do you have the name of the company?
Yeah, I can give it to you after.
The other thing is,
I think that when you're in these trade shows, you're not supposed to advertise, right? Or at these conferences. But
it's a good product right now.
Yeah.
I guess the other question is the costs of comparative costs of a standalone greenhouse opposed to a Gotta Connect double poly.
Which type of greenhouse?
A double poly Gotta Connect. How
Yeah.
much would that be per square foot on average?
A double poly.
Double poly, double.
And
Oh, is that, you know what? It's almost the same price. Believe it or not, if you take not the little cold frame,
No,
like a little cold frame, but
the regular.
a freestanding greenhouse, if you've got a polycarbonate end with adequate cooling
Right.
and a gutter connect, you're almost the same
I
dollar.
Gotta Connect with the roof opening
Yeah.
up, right?
Any kind of ballpark on that square foot price?
We're running, I would say, when people ask me, unless it's very, very small, but it's around the $4, $4.50 a square foot for a plastic greenhouse.
But just the material building is another $10, $15. So total cost is high.
Yeah. If you talk about adding the heating system and the construction. But I just quoted a Venlo greenhouse, and it is local, so that makes a big difference. If the construction crew is local, it makes a huge difference. It's 30%. When we send guys out of town, it costs us 30% of the construction cost. And I've checked with other tradespeople, and that's basically when you start paying for food and lodging and travel time, and that's the rule of thumb. That's a big number. So now you know what all these companies are paying here when they're getting labor out of Ontario and Quebec and Newfoundland. It's expensive.
With the rising energy costs, is there more people using twin wall polycarbonates?
I see more people thinking about it just because of the aggravation of plastic. You know, especially here in the prairies, some of the hail that's been going through here, it's frustrating.
Well, and the longevity's gotten much better. Like, aren't they lasting up to 20 years?
You can get 20 years out of it, yeah. It's definitely better.
And the energy savings, are they still sort of rating that around 30%? Or?
It's the data that we have out there is 30%. Growers are telling me, and it doesn't matter where I go, they say polycarbonate is still warmer than double poly. And part of the reason is when you have double inflated plastic, the insulation factor is the stale air in between the two layers. The truth is, the air between the two layers is always moving. If you have a little bit of wind, you see that plastic doing this, it's still better than single layer, but because you have that air moving between the two layers, it's the wind chill effect. Just like when you go outside in the cold and that wind blows across your bare skin, it's pulling the heat away. So that's what's happening with double poly greenhouses. You don't have that with your twin wall acrylic or polycarbonate.
Is there any data available with respect to the deterioration of plastic versus polycarbonate?
Life expectancy.
Well, not life expectancy, but reduced light over time.
It's a tough one to measure because as plastic gets older, it becomes dirtier, and what happens is there's abrasion as the wind blows over it, and there's always sand particles. Your plastic actually gets scratched, be it ever minute, snow sliding down it, and in those little scratches you start getting dust and pollution. You'd be surprised how much light you gain when you wash your greenhouse. In Holland, because light is such an issue there because they don't have the same light levels as we're used to in most of the areas we grow in Ontario or in Canada. In Holland, almost every grower washes his glass greenhouse roof twice a year. And they have roof washers for doing that. This is a big, you know those floor polishers you see in shopping malls with those brushes? Well, it's a gizmo like that just goes up and down the gutters and washes the roof.
Just water, or do they have some?
No, it's usually just scrub brushes with water. Because even on glass, you will get a film of dirt. Put it in your house.
Think about your car windows or your house windows.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same thing.
And it distorts the reflection. I think that's one of the biggest things. Because the Dutch have also, there's a proper angle for catching the light in the northern hemisphere to get the greatest amount of light when the sun is at its lowest. So that angle, I believe, is 22 degrees, what they say is the best angle. But it also has to do with reflection. So they've done research, and we've sold some already where they have anti-reflecting glass, so that the light, instead of hitting the glass and reflecting off. And there's been something in the news, what was that, hotel in Britain that was reflecting the light so much that it was caused a fire. You know what? It's real. So now what they've done is they've got this anti-reflectant coating on glass so that light doesn't bounce off, it actually does go in. Go ahead.
What's the trade-off between a tall-built greenhouse to help with cooling as opposed to a tall-built greenhouse and it costs you a lot more to heat?
That's a very interesting question because that's been everybody's. The taller the greenhouse, the more it costs me to heat. The only area that it costs you more to heat is on the side walls of the gable. As you go higher, you have more exposed room on the sides. So yes, that costs you more. Whether you have a 10-foot wall or a 20-foot wall, you've got 10 more feet of exposed area letting the cold. But the roof makes no difference. Hot air rises, so where does most of your heat go? Through the roof. Because hot air rises, you've got this climate inside the greenhouse where everything's going up. And why energy curtains work so well, you've got this warm air going up, it hits the curtain, and it's not a conductor. That's the whole principle of how the energy curtains work. It's not a conductor, so that heat hits it, instead of going through, it bounces down. You start getting this kind of a convection going under the curtain. If you don't have an energy screen there, the warm air goes up, hits especially the cold gutters. That's why there's always condensation on the gutter. That gutter's cold, it hits that, and it's like a heat sink. So that warm air goes out the gutter. Let me ask you this question. When is the worst time to heat your greenhouse? Think about that. And that's what will show on a computer. The worst time to heat a greenhouse is if it's 1 degree outside and rainy. It takes more energy to heat a greenhouse at 1 degree rain than minus 30 and no wind. And that's because as the rain comes down the greenhouse, the rain absorbs the heat and it's going down the gutters or down the side of the greenhouse. And it's something you don't really realize till you have a computer system or you really observe, that heater on all day, if it's a rainy day. But that's actually what's happening. That's the whole theory of convection. Now you have an energy curtain. It stops it. So your heat rises, and that heat stays in. Same idea as with, when you wear a shirt. Our bodies give off heat, but this is preventing the heat from going out. If you want to stay warm, what do? You put a hat on or a ball cap. Our bodies are exactly the same. You have cold feet, you're cold all over because your heat is going through your cold, wet feet. But that's important to know. But now, getting back to that climate, now you've got these plants in the greenhouse, and you've got all that you're heating. So yeah, I'm adding heat, but all that air is going like this through the plants and taking the transpiration away. So now we're thinking of the plant transpiring. So if you have your no energy curtain, that plant could actually be hurting for like it's transpiring more than it should because you got that air going through. The flip side is if it's very humid in that greenhouse, the plant wants to transpire, and if it's you got a relative humidity of 90%, that plant can't get rid of it. Do we have any other speaking engagements after? I don't think so. It's just a trade show. I don't want to hold people up. But I don't mind, these are good questions. I don't mind fielding the questions.
I noticed in one of the picture, or a few of the pictures, that all the pillars are painted white now.
Yes.
Trusses too?
Trusses as well. That's typically, well actually there was one greenhouse, the one in BC with the Gerbers. It was a powder coated white. We don't do that very often in North America because it's too expensive. The Dutch greenhouses, the Venlo greenhouse that you see with the powder coated white, that structure, the steel structure, is made by the Dutch company in China. So they're still in charge of the factory. But what they have is they have the welding plant here, rolls right out of the welding plant, right to the hot dip galvanizer, right to the powder coater, and they probably got some little kids at $1 an hour wrapping every piece with paper. That's pretty expensive, the powder coat. The powder coat is not that expensive. It's the labor to put it in the machine, take it out, and individually wrap every piece. It just is not affordable here. Why do they do it? Lets more light in. But interesting, the greenhouse is cooler in the summer. And I don't know if you've ever built a greenhouse or did maintenance on your greenhouse in the summer. You can't touch the steel in the canopy. I mean, it gets that hot. You burn your hands. When you have the white structure, it reflects that heat. It doesn't get hot. So at night, you don't have all that heat coming out of the steel. Which is down to plant science again. A plant needs that different air temperature in daytime and night. A cucumber will grow, all the vegetables will grow in 35 degrees. They can handle 35. After that, they get a little bit, rather not. But the trick is, can you bring the nighttime temperature down so that they go through that, I can forget what you call that. It's a stage that the plant goes through of giving off sugar versus making sugar. And that's one of the big dilemmas that we have in Ontario, is we typically have in the end of July and beginning of August, where we'll have 35 in the daytime, 32 at night. And that's brutal for the growers. You'll see that. There's one set of tomatoes that happens almost every year. All the guys have no tomatoes for, in September, early September. It misses that flush. They don't, and it's just that temperature difference. And that's the big dilemma that they're dealing with in certain tropics. You say, well, why don't they grow it there? You know what? The nighttime temperature is there's not enough difference between day and night. So we have, in Mexico, a lot of lot of the growers, they went there and they built close to the town where the people were. That's the logical place to build, right? But you see now, anybody that's building, they're building it in a remote area, basically at a higher altitude. So at night, guess what? It gets cool, and they're spending some money on heat. They're putting heating systems in those greenhouses in Mexico. But that's just so that you have that diff temperature.
What's the advantage of, like, a lot of the greenhouses are a lot higher?
Yeah.
I mean, the vertical height of the sidewalls, so going from anywhere.
The main reason for the higher greenhouse is you don't feel the instant change in the climate. And just think of your picture window in your house or in the windshield in the car. When you're standing in front of that window and the sun's beating in, you know, or in your car, the one side you're sweating and the other side you feel fairly cool. So, and the same thing is happening in your greenhouse. That heat comes in and the light comes in through your canopy. And if your plants are right there, that's why hanging baskets seem to wilt before the rest of your crop. They're in that heat. So now if you have more air buffer, you have more stratification, you have more mixing before it hits the plant. And that's what the plants like. They don't like that rapid change. Like real cold, real hot, real cold, real hot, or high humidity, low humidity. The plant doesn't know what it's doing.
So is it still going higher, or is it kind of medium?
I think it's going to stop at 24 feet.
Oh, yeah.
The highest I've sold is 23 feet. And depending on the municipality, actually the municipalities are stopping. Now, I'm not convinced personally that it pays to go higher than that. I think it's just who has the highest greenhouse. But you know, a grower will never tell you that. They almost always tell you, you know what, it's better. But I always tell people, ask after about 3 or 4 years. When you buy a new car, even if you say, boy, that was a stupid mistake, you're never going to admit it. You say, yeah, it's the best thing, it's a great car. Right? A year later, say, well, you know, I have a few problems with it. 2 years later, I never should have bought this piece of junk. But that's just the way it goes. So growers will typically say, oh yeah, it's way better because it's taller. But I always say, well, I'll show some data. How many more dollars are you making in that greenhouse? And then they quite often, well, yeah, you know, the humidity's better, yeah, but is it making you more money? To me, that's the importance. But if you're growing vegetables at 10-foot high post height, don't do it. You know, whether you have to go 24 feet, I'm not saying that, but you know, you definitely will be happier at the 18-foot. And don't forget, varieties have changed too. They're growing longer and more taller varieties. Peppers used to max out at, if you had a 14-foot under gutter greenhouse, the pepper would reach the truss at the end of the growing season. Now, it's not unusual to see peppers above the truss. You know, they're still growing, they're still healthy. So they find a way to string it up and support it. Okay.
Well, thank you, Rudy.
Okay. Sorry for keeping you so late.
I think they're smoking.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I love Saskatchewan.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, let's go on. You want to take the, oh, you want to save it on here? Yeah. Just take it. You go ahead. All right. You're better at